Over the last few weeks, we have learned about the fundamental laws of logic, which are the basis of how we process ideas, and we have reviewed many different types of logical fallacies. As we have been studying logical fallacies, we have also been learning about the most important part of logic for our purposes, and that is how to make a logical argument. A logical argument is simply a sequence of reasoning aimed at demonstrating a truth or falsehood using a methodological process of logical thinking. You may be asking yourself, when did we learn how to do this? And the answer is Bob. Bob used many logical arguments that Joe always denied, and Bob was showing us many different logical ways to argue that the earth is round. And we can see Bob applied logic to each line of evidence to use them as logical arguments to show Joe the earth is round. Next, we will see each of Bob's arguments can be logically expressed in detail in stages, so they'll make even more sense to us also. For example, Bob's round satellite photo argument can be broken down by making what are called premises, which are simply principles that should lead us to the conclusion we're trying to prove. The details of the satellite photo argument are: if the earth is round, when you get far enough away from it, you should be able to see the curvature of the earth. A satellite is far enough away from the earth to be able to observe this curvature if it exists, and satellites have actually photographed this curvature of the earth. Therefore, the earth is round. This example here has three premises and a conclusion. The first premise is based on a logical conclusion that distance can enhance observation. To explain this principle, I will ask you to guess what the shape of the next object is from three different perspectives of distance. This is perspective 1. What shape do you think this object is? At this vantage point, we can't really tell. This is perspective 2. What shape do you think the object is now? Here we can begin to see the shape, but we can't be sure that this isn't just one corner. Now, all the way backed up, we can plainly see it is an oval. The object never changed, simply the size of it changed relative to its distance from us. Imagine if you held a basketball right up to your eyeball and you couldn't see the outline. Being too close makes it difficult to see its shape. But if you hold it at arm's length, you can see the shape completely. This is the same idea behind the first premise. The second premise can be proven mathematically or with other means, but the third premise actually proves the second one also. Since satellites have photographed the curvature of the earth, we know they must be far enough away to actually see it. So if all the premises are true, and the conclusion follows or makes logical sense based on those premises, then the conclusion is logical and valid. This is what's called a formal argument, because it's simply breaking down an argument into easy-to-digest pieces so we can analyze it better. Let's look at one more example from one of Bob's arguments and break it down again to see how we intuitively do this with most truth claims that we hear. In Bob's continuous circumnavigation argument, there were some implied premises. Let's unpack them to see if this is a valid and logical argument and practice critical thinking. First, if the earth is round, going in any direction in a straight line from point A will eventually lead you right back to point A. Second, many people have intentionally traveled in a single direction on a straight course and returned to their starting point. Conclusion, therefore, the earth is round. To understand the first premise, picture an ant on a basketball. If that ant walked in a straight line from where he was, would he end up right back where he started? Yes. That means that on a larger scale, the first premise is true. The second premise is confirmed by many different historical accounts of people traveling in a straight line around the world, such as Steve Fawcett, Polly Vacher, and more. It is important to notice that logic simply allowed us to process the truth of these claims. It was not truth itself. To find truth, we had to use observations and many facts about the world around us, combined with sound logic to draw out conclusions. The formula for processing all of that data is what we call an argument, made up of one or more premises and a conclusion. Since we have seen that the first and second premise are true, the next thing to ask is this: does the conclusion make sense based on the premises? And in this case it does, so the conclusion follows from this argument. The facts and this argument are working together in a logical way to support the conclusion that the earth is round. Basically, every truth claim has one or more premises that should lead to the conclusion that the person making the argument is trying to prove, and the conclusion must follow from the premises. By breaking down a claim into this format, you can use critical thinking to look for logical fallacies, errors in reasoning, or illogical premises. This is why logic is so important, as we learned in our first segment. It helps us process every truth claim and evaluate if it's valid, or in other words, if it makes sense in a logical way. By logically analyzing all truth claims, we can break them down and test each part of them to see if they're logical and if they're factually accurate. Like math, all of this seems abstract and not that useful when you're first learning it, until you have to balance your checkbook or pay at a restaurant. Once we apply these tools of critical thinking in our lives, we'll see two major benefits. And the Bible tells us God has given us sound minds, and we are to use them in power and love for these two key purposes. First, by learning how to critically think, we can help reach others with the truth by creating methodical, logical, persuasive arguments that make much more sense to others, so we can help persuade them toward believing the truth. And second, by learning how to analyze all claims critically, we can avoid being persuaded by fallacious, illogical arguments. The Bible teaches that we are to use all the tools that God has given us to cast down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bring every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And it reveals that by just one person being deceived in the garden, sin and death came into the world. We must then battle with the weapons of truth and logic and avoid deception and error, which always leads us and others astray. Once we have sound reasoning, we can use it to help others escape from deception also. So far, we have learned the basics of logic and logical fallacies, and how to make and analyze logical arguments. And we have seen why critical thinking is so important. So let's begin to apply what we've learned to the Bible itself. The Bible obviously and undeniably makes one very important claim that everything it says hinges on, and we can test that main claim using facts and logic. The Bible plainly states, there is a God. And there are many different logical arguments that demonstrate God exists. Each specific argument is based on observations, facts, laws of science, and other solid evidence combined with careful and methodical logic, leading to a sound, reasonable conclusion that effectively casts down the various arguments that are made against the knowledge of God. To begin, we will ask a few rhetorical questions about this image What is the difference between this intricate system of gears, springs, screws, and other mechanical devices compared to a pile of metal? Technically, everything we see here is made of metal. And it could all be the same type of metal, hypothetically, like brass. So what is the difference between these gears and a pile of brass? Here we see a different type of brass in a pile for comparison. What makes this pile of brass any different than the gears? Or better yet, brass comes from copper and zinc. What's the difference between this mineral form and the gears? Stage 1 is brass in its raw, natural copper and zinc form. Stage 2 is processed and purified brass that's similar in size and shape. And Stage 3 is machined and manufactured brass used in a specific device. So let's ask these questions. Does nature ever take brass from Stage 1 to Stage 2? Is there any observable, strictly natural process that would take the mineral form of Stage 1 to the uniform standard form of Stage 2? No. Does Step 2 perform any function that's useful, or is it just somewhat more organized than Stage 1? How about Step 3? Could that ever happen naturally from Stage 1 or Stage 2? Obviously, there's a uniformity in Stage 2 that's not present in the first stage. And there is design and, more importantly, function present in the third stage that's not present in the first or second stage. So we went from a natural state to a processed uniform state to a designed and functional state. There is clearly a progression of complexity here, but what does that progression imply? Does it imply that the material was acted upon by an intelligence? Let's give another example of this concept using lettered cereal. These letters are randomly placed in this bowl, and we don't see any words popping out at us, even though every piece of cereal is a letter. They're all placed together, and there are plenty of letters to make many, many different words. Now, what if you saw the letters arranged in this way? Is this natural, or did an intelligence arrange this? Obviously, Abby or someone who knew her spelled out the name, but how do we know this? In the natural state of this cereal, or its unadulterated state, the cereal does not normally spell out a recognizable word, and the odds are very low that it ever will. But out of a bowl of many letters, just 4 were taken, and placed with clear spacing, in just the right order and orientation, in a way that conveys a message and serves the purpose of communicating. This reveals a design and a function beyond the normal expectations we have for this manufactured cereal to display on its own randomly, so an intelligence must have interacted with it. These logical observations lead us to conclude there is an observable and limited amount of organization and function to all forms of matter in their default natural state. An organizational state more complex and functional than that default natural state requires an intelligent organizer. A watch has a more complex and functional state than its various components possess in their natural default state. Therefore, a watch has an intelligent organizer. To determine if we agree with a conclusion, we must test the 3 premises that lead us to that conclusion to see if they're valid and reasonable. If we look at any substance, there is a basic level of organization that's limited and testable in its default natural state. like the copper and zinc that make up brass in their mineral form, or even lettered cereal after it's being manufactured. These have limits to how organized and functional they can ever be in their default natural state. If the cereal conveyed a message to you, despite the odds, in its natural default state, there would either be a very irrelevant message or a very strong suspicion that an intelligence was behind that message. If you came down to the kitchen and saw a box of cereal spilled on the table with a message next to it saying, "Take out the garbage, Mom," you would conclude that this was intelligently organized to serve a function beyond the natural default state of that cereal, and in this case, Mom was the intelligence behind the message. Writing is not a property of ink, paper, or pens. It's the result of an intelligence using these components together in an intelligent way to serve the function of communication. And in the same way, these gears, springs, and screws and levers reveal much more function, design, and organization than could ever be expected to arrive in any natural way from the basic default state of the minerals that are making up the metals in this image. So we can agree that premise 1 and premise 2 are true, based on our observations and reason. And we conclude so far that an organizational state more functional and complex than the default natural state requires an intelligent organizer like a watchmaker or Mom. So 1 and 2 lead us to our application of their principles to step 3. A watch has a more complex and functional state than its components would have in their natural default state, and that leads us to the conclusion that a watch must have an intelligent organizer. If 1 and 2 are correct, and a watch truly does have more function and complexity than its individual components would ever have in their default natural state, then yes, the conclusion is true. A watch must have an intelligent organizer. And this conclusion is confirmable through other methods like meeting the watchmaker or watching him work. Next, let's see how this argument applies to God and the Bible. Let's take the same exact argument and apply it to a dog instead of a watch. Now, if you're an atheist or an evolutionist, you're probably jumping up and down right now thinking, this is a false analogy. But just stick with me. What are the materials that make up a dog? This question is answered by looking at the basic building blocks of all things, which are called elements. If you exist, and I hope you do, you're made up of these elements we see on the periodic table of elements. These are the known building blocks of everything that physically exists. For living things, only 11 of these elements are found in larger than trace quantities. So whether you're a puppy or a person, these are the basic 11 elements that compose your being. This is the simple truth, and sometimes it helps to look at the basics to understand the bigger picture. The real question is then, what is the natural default state of those 11 elements? Are they normally a puppy, a person, or just elements in our environment? The sad truth is, the natural default state of all the building blocks of life are not puppies. They are environmental and can be thought of as dirt. The building blocks return to the environment when life ends, and this is their natural default state. By the way, the Bible confirms this fact, explaining that when we die, our spirit departs and returns to God who gave it, while the dust that we are made of returns to the earth. All physical life is made up of these same basic elemental building blocks, and when all type of observable life ends, the elements return to their natural default state. So even though we see life and it seems to have magically organized these building blocks to make them separate, special, amazing things, it is the organism's intricate organization itself that actually makes it alive. After each physical life ends, we observe all the building blocks return right back to their environment. And what we call biology becomes recognizable as the organization of life forms to new levels of function and complexity beyond the natural default state of their basic components. This all puts us back to step 3. A dog or any other biological life form is simply a more complex and functional organized state of matter than its various components possessed in their natural default state. Therefore, a dog or any other biological life form has an intelligent organizer. So what intelligence has organized the elements into the cute little puppy? That's the next step we must reason through. And to begin with, many would claim it might be DNA. Scientists now estimate that there are around 37.2 trillion with a T cells in the average human body. The cells are the smallest unit of life that can replicate independently. They also contain the body's hereditary material we call genes, and they can make copies of themselves. The nucleus of the cell serves as its central command center, and it sends out the directions for the cell to grow, mature, divide, or die. And this nucleus also houses the DNA, that cell's hereditary material. We can see that each cell is a very complex organism, and we're made up of trillions of them, and each one is based on our genetic code carried in our DNA. In just 1 gram of DNA, which is less than 1/28 of an ounce, there is potentially over 700 terabytes of data. And just 1 terabyte could hold 1,000 copies of the complete Encyclopedia Britannica. So this gives you an idea of just how much information is stored in every gram of DNA. But why is this important? Because our highly complex and organized DNA is the instruction manual for life. It tells our cells how to process and build all that we are, and without its specific and detailed instructions, we would not exist. We can see that instruction manual for life in each and every cell, and it has been proven that this information contained in that DNA is not random, but very specific and highly organized, and life is the message that it contains. If the message is incorrect or slightly mutated, we might develop a disease or condition. And if the message wasn't there at all, we would not be alive. The DNA message is composed of 4 basic nucleotides, A, G, T, and C, arranged in very specific ways to enable life. And the organization of the dog's DNA allows the dog to live and be organized, and over time, the deterioration of that organization leads to its death. Then all of the elements that make up a dog return to their default natural state. This process, and all that we understand about biology, reveals there's not nearly as much difference between a watch and a dog as some would have us believe. They're both composed of elements in a more organized, complex state than they're naturally found, and they both must have an intelligent organizer that ordered the matter that made them into a more complex and functional state. The big difference is between their high levels of complexity and the higher level of intelligence that must have organized them. There's even a physical law working against this process of organization called entropy that we'll learn about next week. So we see, as we learned about writing earlier, DNA is not the intelligent organizer any more than the letters in Take Out the Garbage Mom might have organized themselves. Some intelligence beyond DNA and beyond observation and beyond nature itself had to organize the highly functional and complex language that makes up a dog, let alone the dog itself. So, the organizational argument reveals that an organizer of unimaginable intelligence must exist to have organized the components of elements, proteins, DNA, cells, structures, and systems that make up even that cute little puppy. And this is confirmed by the fact that even all the minds in the world put together couldn't create a single little puppy out of the 11 elements that make them up. We could only recreate one using the pre-existing DNA code given to us by the original intelligent organizer. Truly, God has invisible attributes like His infinite wisdom that are clearly seen in the things that He has made, and we are without excuse. This week, we've taken one more step into using logic and philosophy to understand why that verse is so true and creation reveals there is a creator.